Well, the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Electoral Officer Ntomb'futhi Masinga is addressing the media on the provincial offices of the Electoral Commission in the Westville in Durban. The purpose of the session is to brief the media on the Commission's readiness to hold the voter registration weekend in preparation of the 2024 general elections. Let's now take you live to that press briefing.
Which is a structure that we set to ensure we have a mechanism at a local level as well as at a provincial level for political parties to intervene in situations where the challenges are of a political nature. We are able to discuss those at that level and decide on the best intervention that will enable a conducive environment for us to deliver an election in every corner of the province.
It's Corinda from Newsroom Africa. Just with regards to safety, over and above the political issues, in KZN we have a high issue of crime, shootings that happen in our province that we see on a daily basis. Are there any concerns for the staff at voter registration with regards to crime that's not necessarily related to political issues?
There is always a concern around the issues of crime. Luckily, during the registration weekend, unlike the other projects that we've implemented until now, including your targeted communication and registration, where we had field workers that were deployed in communities to re-register voters that were affected by VD boundary changes. The voting station infrastructure assessment, which also required our staff to go into those voting stations to assess the state of the infrastructure. The registration weekend is much easier because it is contained within the voting stations. They don't necessarily venture out into people's homes. But working with the SAPS, whilst they may not deploy, they may not have static deployments as such in voting stations like they do in elections. They do patrol around our voting stations so that they are within easy reach of our staff should there be a need for them to get the service of the SAPS. So we are quite cautious of that. We have people that we call area managers who manage a cluster of voting stations, who are our eyes and the ears on the ground, because our staff will be sitting inside voting stations, whereas an area manager patrols their voting stations throughout the day, looking out for any possible incidents that may negatively impact our processes in voting stations. So they have a direct link with our offices, who then have a direct link with the cluster groups of the SAPS, who are ready to respond if there is a need for them to protect our staff at voting stations.
From SABC. Still sticking with the crime issue, I understand that a while back IEC embarked on a campaign, a voter registration campaign, door to door, and in some areas people wouldn't allow you guys inside. So I just wanted to find out, how did the campaign, was it a success, or are there still places where IEC officials couldn't enter?
You are absolutely correct. That was the targeted communication and registration that we conducted in October, around the 20th of October, where we visited 774 VDs that were affected by the VD boundary changes. And we had an incident there, for example, where our staff was attacked in Ilovu, and 2 of our voter management devices were stolen. But through working with the SAPS, before the end of the day, they had recovered those gadgets and they had reprimanded the culprits. So the level of cooperation with the SAPS in this province is quite good. And in terms of the numbers, we were targeting the 774 VDs, and we managed to get 34,100 people who needed to re-register because their address has changed. But over and above those, we were also able to register new voters that had not registered at all during that campaign, and we were also able to harvest addresses because we still have people with an either incorrect or missing or incomplete address on the voters roll. And for us to be able to geocode every address that we have, we need to have sufficient address particulars to be able to place a voter within a correct VD. So we were quite excited with the 34,000 voters that we were able to relocate within a correct voting district, which was the primary objective of these projects. But we're also excited to also be able to achieve other objectives, including finding new voters and harvesting addresses from the voters that we still didn't have addresses for on the voters roll.
Mrs. Masinga, the issue of SAT2, union members then becoming, working for the electoral office, has been raised at a national level. I just want to know if it's been raised at a provincial level through the party liaison committees, and if there were any concerns with SAT2 officials then becoming electoral officers or supervisors.
No, definitely. That has become quite a common issue that keeps coming up wherever we find ourselves as the Electoral Commission. It is not the Commission policy to determine people's membership of unions when they apply to work, because we recruit online through our e-recruitment system, which is on our website, and anyone can go and apply to work. And union membership is not one of the things that we ask, because we believe that we live in a constitutional democracy where every worker in this country is entitled to join a union to protect their rights as workers. So what we do, before we can employ people that we use as presiding officers, we enable political parties an opportunity to scrutinize the names that we give to them and identify any person that they believe will compromise the integrity of the electoral process. And we did that in each of the 44 municipalities in this province, and every political party that is represented in our party liaison committee at municipal and provincial level had an opportunity of going through everyone that we employ as voting station staff, and they had an opportunity to lodge objections against anyone that they believe does not meet this criteria. Through that entire process, we only had 3 objections in the province, and those came from Gwamaphumulo municipality and Reinkonyene municipality. 2 of those were upheld and 1 was rejected. And it's something that we will continue to do with political parties, because we do not necessarily evaluate our staff based on their union membership. We evaluate our staff based on the efficiency of their performance at the voting station. So we have that agreement with political parties, and even political parties that have raised this as an issue were part of that process, where they were given the names of everyone, of the 2 people that are presiding at voting station level, the presiding officer and their deputies, and they had an opportunity to do a background check on them and come back and object if there was anyone that they believe didn't meet that criteria. So we are quite comfortable that the people that we have now are people that have passed that test with the political parties in this province, but they have also passed the test of our security establishments in terms of their criminal records, and then they meet our own criteria where they need to attain an 80% pass mark when we assess them after training.
Ms. Masinga, just 2 questions from my side. I've checked the weather. It's seemingly going to be a nice cloudy weekend, but we know with climate change this can always change. If we do see in KZN, those heavy rains, torrential rains, what could be the plan to maybe just change the situation, because people won't be able to come through? And then the second question, I know you answered about voter apathy, that young people make up the bulk of voters, but in the IEC's experience, where do we find the most, issues of voter apathy? And is it the IEC's responsibility to change that or not?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Where we see it, we don't necessarily see it as voter apathy, because we believe that South Africans really value their democracy. They take it very seriously, and they do participate in elections. What we see is people that are disgruntled with their own political parties. And it is up to them then to make a decision whether, if you are disgruntled with your political party, you then sit back and don't participate in processes altogether. But on our side, we do measure our performance based on voter turnouts, but we know that we are not the only entity that is responsible for getting voters into voting stations. And we, on our side, we have a very vigorous civic education program that we deliver in conjunction with a whole lot of other civil society organizations, where we educate, because some people think that if the voter turnout is too low, for an example, we won't be able to issue a result for an election. Elections in South Africa don't have a threshold. Whether 3 or 3,000 or 3 million people vote, there will be a result and there will be a government based on those people. But because we do care about the legitimacy of the government that gets elected, we do encourage people to go out and vote. We are hopeful that we are doing enough with all the partners in the civil society sector that we work with to encourage voters to still go out, whether they are disgruntled or not, because we want them to believe that their vote still counts. That one vote can make a difference, especially knowing that even within the new dispensation that we have now, where independents can also contest, an independent can win a seat with one vote, because we now have a mixed system at that level. So we're trying to educate as much as possible so that we get people excited about the new possibilities which come with the changes in the legislative framework. In terms of the weather, out of a total of 4,973 voting stations, only 100 of them are temporal voting stations where we use tents, while the permanent voting stations will be affected in terms of the roads, but we worry most about the temporal voting stations that we use in areas where we couldn't find solid structures that we could use as voting stations. But we plan accordingly. There are things that will be beyond us, but in terms of how we've tried to consider the quality of the tents that we use in those voting stations, I think we have come a long way in terms of the suppliers that we were using to provide these tents, in as much as we want to give opportunity to local people who are in that industry. It matters whether they have the quality of tents that we need. So we are quite comfortable, but we are also acknowledging that there are things that may be beyond us. One of them that you mentioned is the roads. Some roads are pretty much fine now, but the moment it rains, they become something else, and it becomes difficult even for our own staff to maneuver to get to voting stations. But like every other South African citizen, we are crossing fingers that the weather play ball during this weekend as well.
Yes, Ufanele. During the national and provincial elections, people have a chance or are allowed to vote anyway. I want to check what is the deadline to apply to vote away from your voting station, because I understand this year it's not going to be those forms that you just filling at the voting station where you are.
Our legal framework requires that you vote where you are registered. It doesn't allow people to vote anywhere. It does, however, provide a mechanism if for emergencies you find yourself outside of the voting station where you are registered, to walk inside a voting station, apply, and be granted that mechanism. However, with the legislative amendments that came with the amended Electoral Act, you can no longer do that. In the same way that we provide for pre-notification in terms of special votes, there is now a requirement for pre-notifying the Electoral Commission if you believe that for whatever reason you will not be at your voting station during the election day. You now need to pre-apply and be approved so that the Electoral Commission is aware how many people will show up at the Westville Civic Center voting station who are not registered there, so that we provision accordingly in terms of our materials. So that provision was amended because it was abused. In some instances, we had incidents of people that had attempted to vote more than once, and political parties made submissions in terms of that amendment. But also, if you allow anyone to walk in any voting station and claim that they cannot be at their voting station, you will run into situations where you run out of material, because you now do not know how many people are going to show up in which voting station. And the voting stations that were affected the most were voting stations in city centers, because everyone just find themselves in the city center and demand to go and vote at the city hall. So we are quite happy with the amendment, because we're not going to have surprises anymore of people that will show up. That provision will benefit somebody who knows in advance that there's a reason why they cannot be at their voting station. Unfortunately, it will not assist someone who then has an emergency on the morning of voting, because you have to be pre-approved. We don't have a date for those applications yet, because that is dependent on the election day. We still are awaiting the president to announce and proclaim the election date. As soon as that happens, then that triggers the finalization of the timetable for the elections. And one of the dates that you will now find on the timetable, we already had a date for the special votes applications, which are people who want to vote on a Monday and Tuesday before the Wednesday. There will now be dates as well for people who would like to apply to vote outside of their voting stations. That is Section 24A of the Electoral Act, and you will know when that window is open for people who would like to apply. I know it will benefit people like ourselves, for an example, who are likely to find ourselves outside of the voting districts on election day. So you can choose whether you want to apply for a special vote, if you will still be within.
Well, there is Ntomb'futhi Masinga, who is the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Electoral Officer in the province, speaking there about the preparations ahead of the voter registration weekend.